Picture this: a lone Templar knight, cloaked in shadows, his armor catching the faintest flicker of torchlight. He stands silent, a guardian of secrets lost to time. We know the names of the Grand Masters, the legendary warriors who shaped the Templar Order's public legacy. But what about those who worked in the darkness, whose stories were never etched into the chronicles? History remembers the faces on the banners, but it's the unseen hands, the scribes, the spies, the stewards, and the strategists who truly wove the fabric of this enigmatic order. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on 25 individuals who stood just outside the spotlight, whose loyalty and sacrifice were the hidden gears turning the Templar machine. Think about the last time you heard the Templars mentioned. Chances are it was about their battles, their treasures, or their dramatic fall. But behind every famous knight, there were dozens of unsung figures: the quartermaster who ensured armies were fed, the translator who bridged cultures in secret negotiations, the blacksmith who forged weapons without recognition. These weren't just footnotes, they were the lifeblood of the Order. Why does it matter? Because history isn't just made by the leaders we celebrate, it's shaped by the ordinary people who did extraordinary things in silence. Their omissions from the records don't diminish their impact, they make their stories all the more compelling to uncover. So let's begin a journey into the overlooked corners of the Templar world. We'll meet the woman who managed the Order's vast network of safe houses, the scribe who encoded their most sensitive messages, and the forgotten envoy who brokered alliances in plain sight. Some of these names may sound unfamiliar now, but by the end, you'll see how the Templars' legacy was built as much on secrecy as it was on swords. This isn't just a list, it's a rediscovery of the humanity behind the myth, the quiet forces that kept the Order alive. Ready to meet the faces history tried to erase? Their stories start now. The first face in the shadows belongs to a man whose quills scratched tirelessly by candlelight, a scribe whose identity vanished into the margins of the very records he kept. While Templar knights rode into battle with banners unfurled, this unknown monk labored in the stillness of scriptoriums, translating whispered orders into meticulous ledgers. His fingers tracked every dinar spent on armor, every shipment of grain to distant outposts, even the coded rituals performed behind closed doors. Think about the power he held, not with a sword, but with ink. Without him, the Order's vast financial network, the backbone of their influence, would have crumbled into chaos. Yet here's the cruel twist: the man who preserved their secrets was deemed too insignificant to name. Historians pore over his flawless handwriting, his system of symbols, even the faint smudges left by his sleeve on parchment, but the scribe himself erased. Consider the weight of that silence. He documented the Grand Master's decrees, the oaths sworn in midnight ceremonies, the coordinates of hidden treasuries, yet no chronicler thought to jot down his story. Was it deliberate, a precaution to protect the Order's inner workings, or simply the presumption that such work was beneath notice? What we do know is this: his anonymity became his legacy. While knights' tombs were carved with epitaphs, his resting place, if it exists at all, bears no marker. But scribes weren't the only ghosts in the Templar machine. For every coded scroll this man sealed with wax, there was another figure waiting in the wings, someone who turned those words into action. Picture the quartermaster who deciphered those ledgers, transforming numbers into swords, into bread, into the very sinews of war, while the scribe's ink preserved the Templars' secrets. Another man worked in even greater darkness, a master of deception whose hands didn't write history but rewrote it. Meet the Order's forgotten forger, an artisan so skilled his counterfeit seals and parchments passed as holy writ in royal courts across Europe. When kings demanded to inspect Templar ledgers or hostile bishops sought evidence to condemn them, this unnamed craftsman stepped into the shadows with quill, wax, and an uncanny eye for detail. His workshop wasn't in some grand chapter house, but likely a hidden cellar where candle smoke mixed with the tang of aging parchment and freshly mixed inks. Consider the pressure of his work. One slip of the pen, one imperfect replication of a noble's seal, and entire Templar commanderies could have fallen. Yet surviving records show his forgeries were flawless. He didn't just copy documents, he breathed life into them, aging paper with precise stains, replicating the idiosyncratic flourishes of rival scribes, even embedding strands of authentic thread into counterfeit wax seals. When Pope Clement V's investigators demanded financial records in 1307, it was likely this man's hand that produced proof of the order's innocence, documents so convincing they delayed confiscations for months. But here's the moral labyrinth few discuss. Was his deception dishonorable or the ultimate act of loyalty? The Templars swore oaths of honesty, yet their survival sometimes demanded the opposite. This forger walked that razor's edge daily, knowing his art protected not just gold, but the lives of brothers who'd never know his name. Rival factions eventually grew suspicious. French treasury agents began noting slight discrepancies in parchment thickness. German inquisitors whispered about too perfect handwriting, but by then the damage was done. His forgeries had bought the order precious time to move assets, destroy incriminating records, and prepare hidden defenses. What's chilling is how thoroughly he vanished. No trial records mention him, no confiscated tools appear in inventories. Perhaps he was quietly eliminated to protect secrets, or maybe, just maybe, he slipped away before the arrests began, taking his techniques to some new shadowed workshop. One thing's certain, his legacy lives on in every baffled historian who still debates which surviving Templar documents are genuine and which are masterful lies inked by a ghost. And speaking of ghosts, our next figure operated in even deeper obscurity, a strategist who turned the Templars' greatest weakness into an invisible weapon. The Templars didn't just wield swords, they mastered the art of the unspoken deal, and no one embodied this more than the man we'll call the Shadow Diplomat. While knights clashed on battlefields, this polyglot moved through backchannels, his fluency in Arabic, Old French, and Latin smoothing tensions between the Order and the very empires they were supposed to fight. Picture a lone figure in a nondescript robe, slipping into a Damascus courtyard under cover of night, his satchel stuffed not with weapons but with proposed trade routes and prisoner exchanges. Official chronicles paint the Crusades as endless war, but his unsanctioned negotiations saved countless lives, brokering ceasefires, securing pilgrims safe passage, even arranging covert grain shipments during sieges. Here's where history gets uncomfortable. His greatest triumph was also his deepest shame. In 1289, as the last Crusader strongholds crumbled, he struck a secret pact with a Mamluk commander, Templar, gold in exchange for the peaceful surrender of Tortosa's civilians. The deal worked, families walked free, but when word reached the Pope, the Order publicly denounced the arrangement as heresy, sacrificing their own diplomat's reputation to preserve their fragile standing with the Church. No scroll bears his signature, no Templar roll credits his actions, yet surviving Mamluk correspondence hints at his identity. A Frankish envoy referred to only as al-Mutajim al-Amin, the trusted translator. What makes his story so haunting isn't just the betrayal, but the razor's edge he walked. Every handshake with a Muslim ruler risked accusations of collusion. Every whispered agreement could have been a trap, Yet without him, the Templars would have been crushed decades earlier. His legacy, a single line in a Genos merchant's diary. The silent one knows the price of peace is paid in silence. And while this diplomat traded in words, another figure dealt in something far more tangible, the glittering lifeblood of the Templar machine. Because behind every secret treaty, there was a man who made sure the gold never ran out. The Templars didn't just amass wealth, they reinvented it. And the architect of their financial revolution was a man whose name no ledger ever recorded. Picture a dimly lit chamber in the Paris Temple, where this anonymous banker bent over parchment, ink-stained fingers tracing columns of numbers that would reshape Europe's economy. While knights took vows of poverty, he engineered a system where money could travel without moving. Pilgrims deposited gold in one city, received coded letters of credit, and withdrew funds halfway across Christendom. No more chests of coin vulnerable to bandits, just a wax seal and a cipher known only to trusted brothers. This was genius bordering on heresy. The church forbade usury, but his donation fees and exchange rate cleverness skirted the rules. Kings borrowing for crusades found their debts meticulously tracked in his double-entry ledgers, a concept so advanced. Historians would later credit Italian merchants for inventing it centuries after his death. Yet here's the irony: the very system that made the Templars indispensable also sealed their fate. When Philip IV of France coveted their wealth, it was this banker's innovations that made their riches impossible to fully confiscate. He'd already scattered assets across borders, hidden reserves behind labyrinthine partnerships, even created dummy accounts to mislead auditors. But money, like secrets, needs guardians. And as the banker's ledgers grew, so did the risk of betrayal. Enter the fifth shadow, a vault keeper whose existence survives only in fragments of burned account books. While the banker moved fortunes on parchment, this man knew where every physical coin rested. His maps led not to holy relics but to unmarked caves in the Pyrenees, to false-bottomed wagons rolling toward Swiss monasteries, to hollow altar stones in forgotten chapels. Where the banker dealt in numbers, the vault keeper dealt in silence, his loyalty measured by the fact that under torture, not a single Templar revealed his identity. Rumors persisted for centuries. A Spanish merchant's diary from 1342 mentions a keeper of the keys who disappeared into the Alps with 12 mule loads of God's silver. A Venetian spy report describes an elderly man matching his description dying in a Rhodes prison, whispering coordinates to a jailer who later dug up nothing but an empty iron chest. Whether myth or man, his legacy endures in every treasure hunter still scouring Europe for Templar gold, because the greatest trick wasn't amassing wealth, but making it vanish when the world came knocking. And vanish it did, thanks to another figure who turned secrecy into an art form. The Cryptic Quartermaster operated in a world of shadows and whispers, where a single misplaced crate could mean starvation for an entire garrison. While knights basked in glory, this faceless strategist navigated black market networks, bribed Venetian grain merchants, and coordinated shipments under the noses of rival lords. His ledgers, written in cipher, tracked everything from the salt reserves at Montségur to the exact number of arrowheads stockpiled beneath cracked des Chevaliers. What made him extraordinary wasn't just his precision, but his foresight. When Saladin's forces blockaded Acre in 1187, it was his hidden granaries, dug years earlier beneath bakeries and brothels, that kept the Templars fighting for months after others surrendered. Yet his true weapon was misdirection. To outsiders, Templar supply chains appeared chaotic. A lost shipment of armor here, a stolen wagon of wine there. In reality, every mishap was staged. a broken axle on a mountain pass that diverted attention from 3 lighter carts slipping through a river ford. A drunken quartermaster boasting in a tavern. The man was a decoy. The real strategist never drank, never spoke above a murmur, and likely wore the robes of a merchant or monk to avoid notice. Even his name was a rotating cipher. Brothers referred to him only by titles like the Provider or the Silent Steward, ensuring no single identity could be tortured out of them. But here's the twist. His greatest logistical feat was spiritual. Those supply routes doubled as communication lines for the Order's most sacred secrets. Coded messages hid in bales of wool. Encrypted maps traveled inside hollowed-out loaves of bread. When the Church accused the Templars of heresy, it was the Quartermaster's network that smuggled out relics and sacred texts before inquisitors could burn them. His anonymity wasn't just practical, it was sacramental, a vow as solemn as any knight's oath. And while he ensured bodies were fed, another figure tended to souls, a chaplain who heard confessions in the dark, binding brothers to silence with something sharper than any sword. Among the shadows of the Templar Order moved a woman whose hands mended both flesh and faith, the Nameless nun. While knights earned glory on the battlefield, she moved through the blood-stained aftermath, her herbal poultices and whispered prayers the last hope for dying men. Historians rarely mention her, but fragmentary hospital records hint at her existence. A Sister of Mercy who served in the infirmaries of Acre and Jerusalem, her remedies blending ancient medicine with unshakable devotion. Picture her bending over a feverish night, grinding lavender and myrrh into salves, or stitching wounds with thread soaked in wine to ward off infection. Her methods, though dismissed by male chroniclers as women's superstitions, were often more effective than the crude surgeries of battlefield physicians. Gender dictated her anonymity. Medieval scribes recorded the deeds of fighting men, not the women who kept them alive. Yet surviving letters from wounded Templars tell another story. One knight, recovering at Crac des Chevaliers, wrote of a grey-clad angel who cooled his burns with aloe linen wraps and recited psalms until his nightmares ceased. Another described her calming entire wards with a chant now lost that supposedly slowed bleeding, her greatest defiance training other women in secret. When a bishop banned unattended females from treating soldiers, she simply taught her skills to laundresses and cooks who carried herbs in their apron pockets and whispered diagnoses under the guise of fetching water. The irony is crushing. The same order that revered the Virgin Mary erased the women who embodied her compassion. No portrait survives of the Nameless nun, no grave marker bears her fingerprints in stone. But traces linger in unlikely places. A 14th century herbal manual attributed to a Brother Matthias contains remedies unmistakably in a woman's hand, with margins noting lunar cycles for harvesting herbs, a practice male monks rarely documented. Was this her legacy, smuggled into orthodoxy by a grateful pupil? Her story cracks open a wider truth. The Templars relied on women more than their statutes admitted. Beyond the infirmary, women managed estates, encrypted letters, even funded campaigns through dowries diverted to the order. One noblewoman, Elena of Vigil, was quietly noted in a papal reprimand for overzealous stewardship of Templar lands, a coded nod to her role as a de facto treasurer. Another, known only as the widow of Ascalon, allegedly smuggled intelligence through embroidery, stitching troop movements into tapestries shipped to Cyprus. These women didn't just serve the order, they subverted it from within, turning the patriarchy's blind spots into shields. And as the nuns' healing hands faded from memory, another figure emerged, one who wielded not herbs, but the power of the written word to shape the order's destiny. Deep in the vaults of a ruined Templar infirmary, buried beneath crumbled mortar and the dust of centuries, lies a single page of vellum, its edges charred, its ink faded to ghosts of letters. This fragile scrap tells the story of the seventh shadow, the herbalist who defied God. Not a knight, not a priest, but a man who walked the razor's edge between healer and heretic, his hands stained not with blood but with the juices of plants so potent they bordered on magic. While physicians bled patients with leeches and invoked saints to cure fevers, this unnamed brother worked in moonlit gardens, harvesting mandrake under planetary alignments and fermenting moldy bread into poultices that, against all medieval logic, actually healed. His manuscripts, written in cipher, mixed scripture with shocking practicality. When the wound putrefies, apply the green bread mold as Job applied figs to his boils. To the Church, this was blasphemy. To dying Templars, it was salvation. His greatest crime, knowledge traded in shadows, Arabic medical texts smuggled from Damascus, forbidden by papal decree, whispered their secrets to him. He learned to distill opium from poppies for pain relief, to grind willow bark into a bitter powder that eased inflammation, remedies so effective they threatened the established order. When a bishop demanded to know how wounded knights recovered unnaturally fast, the herbalist's workshop was torched, but not before he'd hidden his most precious work inside hymn books, his formulas disguised as musical notation. Here's the tragic irony: his innovations might have saved the order itself. In 1307, as Templars sickened in French dungeons, plague crept through the cracks. Those who'd secretly carried his remedies, tiny vials of tincture sewn into hems, survived longer under torture. Their confessions, historians note, were suspiciously coherent compared to the fever-ravaged ravings of others. Was it divine intervention, as inquisitors claimed, or proof that the herbalist's witchcraft was simply science ahead of its time? His legacy lives in the oddest places. A 15th-century monastic painting of Saint Benedict shows him holding a peculiar flower, one matching the herbalist's notes on wound-cleaning herbs. Coincidence, or a quiet tribute from a brother who remembered? But as the last vials of his tinctures shattered under inquisitors' boots, another figure was already stepping forward, one who didn't heal bodies, but erased them entirely. The eighth shadow wore the keys of his captors around his neck, a jailer whose loyalty belonged not to the crown, but to the broken men shivering in his cells. While the world remembers the Templars' trials, few know of the prisoner's confidant, the turnkey who risked his life to smuggle wax tablets beneath bread crusts, who sharpened fingernails into makeshift pens so condemned knights could etch their final testimonies onto damp stone walls. His name is lost, but his methods survive in fragments. A coded knock mimicking the call of a nightjar, a hollowed-out broom handle carrying letters to sympathetic scribes outside, even the strategic misplacement of torture tools to buy prisoners precious hours of clarity before interrogations. Consider the exquisite danger of his compassion. In 1307, when Philip IV's inquisitors demanded confessions, this man became the order's last lifeline. He rearranged prison rosters to keep brothers together, allowing them to rehearse consistent testimonies. He dipped rags in vinegar and pressed them to burned flesh between torture sessions, not just to ease pain, but to keep tongues lucid enough to recite the Templar rites one last time. His greatest act of defiance, preserving the Chinon parchment, the document where Pope Clement secretly absolved the Templars of heresy. While officials burned copies, the confidant smuggled one out sewn into the lining of a dead prisoner's shroud. But here's the moral fissure few confront: his betrayal of his own role. As a jailer, he'd sworn oaths to the French crown, yet when forced to choose between duty and humanity, he knelt beside shackled men not as their keeper, but as their last brother. Inquisitors grew suspicious. Why did Templars from his dungeon die with eerily similar last words? Why did their confessions suddenly include cryptic references to the Keeper of the Keys? By 1312, the trap closed. A ledger from the Chatelet prison notes the arrest of an unnamed guard caught with a blood-stained psalter filled with marginalia in Templar cipher. The entry ends mid-sentence. His legacy lives in the unlikeliest places. Modern scholars still debate whether certain lost testimonies, accounts too consistent to be coerced, were secretly curated by his hand. And in the Vatican secret archives, one parchment bears faint indentations along its edges, as if gripped by someone with keys permanently notched into their fingertips. Yet, even as this jailer's light flickered out, another kind of resistor emerged, one who fought not with stealth, but with the most dangerous weapon of all, the truth shouted from the shadows. The ghostly messenger moved like smoke through medieval Europe, a figure so adept at vanishing, even his own shadow seemed to betray him. While kings and bishops hunted Templar secrets, this unnamed courier slipped through their nets for 3 decades, his satchel stuffed with letters that could have toppled empires. His disguises were works of art, a limping beggar with coded pleas scratched into his wooden bowl, a spice merchant whose cinnamon pouches hid parchment thinner than onion skin, even a leper whose bandages concealed tiny scrolls in their foul-smelling folds. But his true genius lay in the letters themselves, written in dancing ink, a mixture of gallnut extract and vinegar that vanished when heated, only reappearing when brushed with pomegranate rind. They passed inspection as blank parchment if intercepted. His routes defied logic. A message from Paris to Cyprus might detour through a Scottish wool trader's ledger, a Spanish nun's hymnal, even a dead pilgrim's shroud before reaching its destination. Templar commanders developed an eerie shorthand for his reliability. If the wind knows our words, it learned them from him, and the wind did know. In 1305, when Philip IV's agents raided a Templar preceptory in Tours, they found empty pigeon coops and cold hearths. The messenger had evacuated the birds days earlier, sensing the coming storm. His warning gave knights just enough time to burn sensitive documents, though not enough to save themselves. Here's the chilling paradox of his craft. The more successful he was, the fewer records exist of his existence. Only one tangible clue survives: a merchant's complaint to the Doge of Venice about a mute scribe who paid triple the going rate for carrier pigeons, then released them unburdened into the sky. Historians now suspect this was his masterstroke, training birds to fly decoy routes, drawing pursuers away from the real couriers, illiterate shepherds, minstrels, and midwives who carried fragments of messages without ever knowing their meaning. But secrecy has a cost. The last reference to the messenger comes from a French dungeon in 1312, where a broken Templar scribbled in his own blood, "The wind no longer speaks." No one knows if he was captured, killed, or simply dissolved into the countryside like one of his own vanishing inks. What's certain is that without him, the Templar network fractured, letters went unanswered, alliances crumbled, and the Order's greatest weapon, its web of knowledge, began to unravel. And as the messenger's footsteps faded, another figure emerged from the silence, one who bore not letters, but the weight of the Order's darkest hour. The mute bodyguard stood where sound couldn't reach him, a fortress of flesh and bone in a world of whispers. Born deaf, this warrior turned his so-called weakness into an unbreakable shield. While other Templars flinched at interrogation threats, he simply stared past his captor's screams, his face a cipher no torture could crack. Commanders exploited his silence ruthlessly. He guarded clandestine meetings where even lip-reading was impossible, not because he couldn't hear the plans, but because he'd never be tempted to repeat them. Legends cling to him like the scent of old iron. In Acre's last days, he held a collapsing tunnel single-handedly, buying time for evacuating brothers as Saracen war drums thundered above, drums he never heard, making their intimidation useless. A Venetian spy once boasted of plying Templars with wine to loosen tongues, only to wake in an alley with his own dagger pinning a note to his sleeve, "Speak again, and my next reply won't be paper." The mute bodyguard's signature, no signature at all, just the perfect grammar of violence delivered without a word. But his true mastery wasn't combat, it was reading the tremors others ignored. A twitch in a merchant's cheek betrayed poisoned wine. The vibration of footsteps through stone revealed assassins scaling walls. He didn't need ears when the earth itself whispered warnings. That's why the Order's inner circle trusted him with their most heretical secret, escorting the so-called Headless Saint, a relic so controversial, even whispering its description was punishable by excommunication. Yet history forgets the cruel paradox of his service. The same commanders who relied on his silence denied him the sacrament's medieval theology held that deafness barred him from confession, and thus absolution. So he died unshriven, his soul ostensibly trapped in purgatory, while the secrets he carried stayed locked in a vault no priest could ever open. And as this warrior's hands finally stilled, another figure perfected silence in an entirely different way. Not through disability, but artistry. The anonymous architect never signed his towers, but his genius shouts from every stone. While Templar knights trained for battle, this unnamed builder waged war with geometry, crafting fortresses that bled attackers dry before they even reached the gates. His masterwork, the labyrinth beneath cracked des Chevaliers, a honeycomb of dead-end corridors, murder holes disguised as drainage vents, and staircases that spiraled left instead of right, forcing right-handed invaders to fight at a crippling disadvantage. Modern engineers still marvel at his leaning walls, an optical illusion where parapets appeared to bow outward, tricking besiegers into misjudging arrow ranges. His true brilliance lay in what wasn't built. No surviving blueprint shows the system of counterweighted drawbridges that could collapse into instant ramps, or the cisterns secretly linked to flood tunnels. That's because his designs lived solely in his head, dictated piecemeal to illiterate masons who knew only their small section of the puzzle. When the Order fell, his apprentices were reportedly blinded or sworn to silence under penalty of eternal damnation. Yet fragments of his methods leaked out in bizarre ways. A stonemason's doodle in Margat's quarry shows a peculiar keystone design later found in Welsh castles. A Genos ship's log mentions the Frankish madman who paid sailors to transport sacks of special mortar to Cyprus, a recipe modern tests reveal contained crushed volcanic glass, making it set harder than diamond. The cruelest twist, his innovations outlived his name. When Edward I built his Iron Ring of Welsh castles, historians credited his French engineer, Master James. But the concentric walls, the arrow loops angled to cover blind spots, even the latrine chutes that doubled as boiling oil conduits, all were perfected by Templars decades earlier. The anonymous architect's legacy wasn't just in stone, but in the very DNA of medieval warfare. And as his last fortress fell silent, another figure was already weaving the Order's legacy into something far more enduring than walls, a tapestry not of wool but of whispered stories. The Illuminator without a name worked in a prison of light, his cell a scriptorium's sunlit alcove, his shackles the very gold leaf he painstakingly applied to sacred pages. While monks chanted psalms overhead, this artist hid heresy in holiness, weaving forbidden geometry into the margins of psalters and disguising Templar rites as decorative knotwork. His most subversive act, a Bible commission for Pope Innocent III, where the serpent in Eden's garden coiled into the exact shape of the Order's secret sigil, and the halo of Saint Michael concealed a tiny, perfect labyrinth, the same pattern etched into the floors of Templar chapter houses. Consider the audacity of his craft. Every brushstroke walked a razor's edge, too obvious, and the Inquisition would burn the manuscript and him with it. Too subtle, and the message would be lost. His solution, a visual language only initiates could decipher. The colors themselves carried meaning: vermilion for warnings, lapis lazuli for safe houses, malachite for compromised allies. Even the gilding held secrets. Microscopic scratches on gold leaf formed coordinates when viewed through a crystal lens, a technique modern conservators only discovered when restoring a damaged antiphonary in 2012. But his true mastery lay in weaponizing beauty. When accused of idolatry, the Templars pointed to his manuscripts as proof of devotion. Yet those same pages contained maps to hidden treasuries in the floral borders, or battle strategies disguised as Adam's ribs in anatomical studies. The Illuminator understood what modern propagandists forget. Persuasion works best when wrapped in splendor. A Crusader knight might dismiss a whispered rumor, but when an angel in a sacred text clutched a shield bearing the same strange symbol he'd seen carved in a crypt beneath Jerusalem, that coincidence became divine revelation. His legacy survives in eerie echoes. A 15th century alchemy manual features the exact same accidental ink blot found in 3 of his works, proof that someone preserved his cipher across generations. More chilling, the Vatican's own copy of De Laudibus Sancti Crucis shows evidence of tampering pages carefully scraped to remove gilded patterns that, under ultraviolet light, still reveal the ghostly outlines of Templar crosses. Was this censorship or secret preservation by a sympathetic cleric? And as this artist's pigments faded into history, another creator picked up the brush, not to hide secrets, but to forge an entire identity from scraps of parchment and whispers. The Bard of the Barracks never wielded a sword. His weapons were melody and memory. In smoky taverns and torchlit halls, this unnamed minstrel turned Templar triumphs into ballads so potent they outlasted the stones of their fallen castles. Picture him strumming a lute strung with horsehair, his voice rough from campfire smoke as he sang of Montgisard's miracle, where 500 knights shattered Saladin's army. But here's what made him dangerous. He didn't just glorify victories. His dirges for lost brothers, like the haunting where the cypress weeps, preserved details no chronicle dared record. The names of squires left to die as rearguards, the exact weight of the chains binding drowned Templars tossed into the Nile after Mansura's disaster. Church authorities despised him, not for the songs themselves but for their stubborn accuracy. When papal legates claimed the Templars abandoned Acre without a fight, his ballad, The Last Gate, spread like wildfire through Europe's taverns, detailing how Marshal Pierre de Sèvres held the postern alone for 3 hours, buying time for civilians to flee. A bishop's decree might burn, but a tune hummed by merchants and laundresses, impossible to erase. Fragments of his work survive in bizarre places. A Spanish shepherd's diary from 1422 quotes a verse about the white cloak stained with starless night, likely referencing Jacques de Mollay's execution. A Venetian courtesan's memoir mentions teaching a knight's lament to her clients, its lyrics matching a Templar graffito found in Chinon's dungeon. But his masterpiece was The Ninefold Knot, a deceptively cheerful drinking song that, when certain verses were sung backward, revealed the locations of hidden reliquaries. The irony, his greatest protection was his anonymity. Dozens of bards claimed his songs as their own, scattering his legacy into the folk tradition. When inquisitors demanded to know who composed the heretical ballad about Templars sharing bread with Sufi mystics, even tortured minstrels couldn't name a ghost. And while his melodies lingered in the air, another keeper of memory worked in silence, not with strings, but with the sharp edge of a chisel. The Chronicler's apprentice moved through the Inquisition's vaults like a shadow with a singular mission: to steal back what the flames had tried to erase. Barely 16, this unnamed boy had spent his days grinding ink and trimming quills for the church's scribes, his hands perpetually stained with the colors of obedience. But when the order fell, he turned those same hands into instruments of quiet rebellion. Night after night, he slipped into locked scriptoriums where condemned Templar manuscripts awaited burning, copying their contents onto scraps of parchment hidden inside his sleeves. His tools were humble: a candle shielded by his palm, a stylus so thin it could etch letters smaller than fleas. But his risk was monumental. One slip, one creak of a floorboard, and he'd joined the heretics in the pyre. What drove him wasn't just courage, but cunning. He'd learned to mimic the official script of papal decrees, forging authorized labels to slip forbidden texts back onto library shelves. A Psalter with Templar rites became a commentary on St. Augustine once he'd rebounded. A ledger detailing the order's hidden routes was disguised as a merchant's tax record. But his masterpiece was the Codex Silenti, a single volume where he compressed 32 condemned manuscripts into a palimpsest, layer upon layer of overwritten secrets. To casual inspection, it appeared to be a dull treatise on vineyard management, but held to the light at a precise angle, the faint impressions of Templar sigils and battle plans emerged like ghosts. History nearly lost him to a wine stain. In 1311, a clumsy cleric knocked over a goblet, soaking a shelf of boring agricultural texts. As the apprentice frantically blotted the Codex Silenti, a suspicious librarian noticed the pages warping unnaturally, too thick for simple parchment. The boy vanished that night, but not before smuggling the codex to a Cistercian monastery, where it lay forgotten in a wine cellar for 2 centuries. When scholars finally decoded it in 1923, they found battle strategies, herbal remedies, even the lost rule of the Midnight Chapter, all preserved because a child refused to let knowledge die. And that knowledge would soon find its most dangerous wielder, a figure who didn't just preserve the past, but twisted it into a weapon sharper than any Templar sword. The librarian spy moved through the candlelit stacks of rival libraries like a scholar-shaped shadow, his fingers tracing spines not to read but to erase. Officially, he was Brother Alaric, a humble Benedictine sent to catalog manuscripts. In truth, he was the Templars' most delicate weapon, a man who understood that sometimes preserving history meant selectively destroying it. His targets weren't random. A papal ledger here, a bishop's private diary there, any document that could twist the order's actions into heresy, his tools. A pumice stone to scrape ink without tearing parchment, a vial of ox gall mixed with ash to mimic aged vellum, and a steady hand that could forge a bishop's seal faster than the man himself could pray. Consider the moral tightrope he walked. When he discovered a fabricated letter claiming Templars worshipped a cat-headed idol, he didn't just steal it, he replaced it with a clumsier forgery implicating the document's own creator. The resulting scandal discredited the accuser and bought the order precious time, but his masterpiece was the Vatican fire. In 1308, as anti-Templar fervor peaked, he allegedly let a candle, accidentally, ignite a chest of confiscated trial records. The blaze consumed only the most damning testimonies, leaving behind a single, miraculously unscorched scroll, a list of the accuser's own financial debts to the order. The message was clear: attack us and your secrets burn too. Yet here's the twist that haunts historians. The same hands that saved the Templars from slander also purged their rivals' legitimate grievances. A Moorish diplomat's peace proposal gone. A Jewish moneylender's receipt proving fair interest rates reduced to ash. The librarian spy didn't just defend truth, he curated it, deciding which voices deserved to echo through time. Was he a guardian of justice or a high-minded vandal? Even his own brethren wavered. One surviving letter from a Templar commander praises his holy discretion, while another laments that brothers who alter God's words may find their tongues loosened in hell. His undoing came from an unexpected quarter, not a rival scholar, but a lovesick scribe. When a young nun noticed certain manuscripts disappearing after his visits, she tracked his movements not out of suspicion, but infatuation. Her meticulous diary, ironically preserved in a Spanish convent, records how he smuggled documents inside hollowed-out hymnals and used lemon juice to fade incriminating lines. The very attention to detail that made him brilliant betrayed him, and as this scholar's candle guttered out, another flame was already flickering to life, one that wouldn't preserve secrets but exploit them with chilling precision. Because the 16th Shadow wasn't a defender of the Order, but its most unlikely executioner, the 16th Shadow wore his betrayals like a second skin, a man so skilled in deception, even his own heartbeat seemed to follow a script. Known only as the Traitor's Shadow, this double agent didn't just infiltrate the Templars' enemies, he became them. To the French crown, he was a disgruntled sergeant leaking secrets for gold. To the Order, he was the needle threading poison back into their adversaries' veins. His masterpiece, a forged letter hinting at Templar treasure buried beneath a Paris brothel, a ruse that diverted Philip IV's agents for months while real assets vanished into the Alps. But the cost of his artistry was a soul frayed to threads. Surviving correspondence, likely written in his own hand under duress, reveals a man haunted by his reflection. "I dream in languages I do not speak," one scrap confesses, "and wake to hands that feel borrowed." The psychological toll was monstrous. To maintain cover, he attended executions of brothers he'd trained with, even volunteering to light the pyres. A papal spy's report notes how he once vomited after calmly drinking with an inquisitor who just tortured a Templar chaplain, a lapse he blamed on tainted wine. The ultimate irony, his greatest deception may have been against himself. In 1311, as the Order crumbled, he fed the French a final, glittering lie, coordinates to a phantom vault beneath Chartres Cathedral. While diggers tore up sacred floors, he disappeared, but not before leaving one last cipher scratched into a prison cell wall. Modern cryptographers believe it translates to, "I forgot which side I was on." Was he hero or heretic? The answer depends on which shadow you ask. To Templar survivors, his false trails bought them time to scatter. To historians, his methods blurred the line between sacrifice and sin. And perhaps that ambiguity was his final act of genius, a legacy too tangled for easy judgment. Because the razor's edge he walked wasn't just between loyalty and betrayal, but between the man he pretended to be and the one he buried alive beneath the performance. And as his footsteps faded into myth, another figure emerged, one who didn't manipulate truth but weaponized time itself. The fugitive alchemist worked where fire and faith collided, a man who dared to ask what would happen if Templar gold wasn't just currency but a catalyst. Officially, Brother Renaud was a humble infirmarian, tasked with distilling herbs for the sick. But in the cellar of Chez Pellerin, behind a door marked only with a black cross, he conducted experiments that would have made even the boldest scholars blanch. His crucibles didn't just melt metal, they sought to transmute it, blending alchemy with the Order's most guarded secret, traces of gold purportedly smuggled from Solomon's temple, said to hold properties no earthly ore possessed. Witnesses spoke of eerie flames that burned blue without heat, powders that shimmered like crushed stars, a single drop of liquid silver that dissolved an iron nail in moments. When a visiting bishop demanded to see the source of these miracles, Renaud presented him with a vial of holy water that turned common lead into something resembling gold for exactly 33 minutes before reverting. The implications were explosive. If the Templars could manufacture even fleeting wealth, their financial dominance would become unchallengeable, but whispers spread faster than experiments. By 1294, the word sorcery clung to Renaud like the sulfur scent of his workshop. His downfall came from an unexpected quarter, not the church but the order itself. Fearful that his work would draw disastrous scrutiny, the Templar High Command ordered his apparatus destroyed. Yet the night before the raid, a fire accidentally consumed his laboratory. All that remained were twisted crucibles and a single cryptic note pinned to the door with a dagger. "Seek the white gold where the sun drowns." Renaud vanished into legend. Some claimed he fled to Moorish Spain, trading secrets with Jewish alchemists in Cordoba. A Genos ship's log mentions a passenger matching his description disembarking in Alexandria with a chest that weighed nothing, yet required 6 men to lift. The wildest rumor that he staged his death using a doppelganger's corpse, a beggar allegedly plied with silver and wine until his veins turned the telltale alchemical black, then slipped into the shadows with a vial of something far more precious than gold. But science wasn't the only forbidden discipline flourishing in the Order's shadows, because while Renaud bent the laws of nature, another figure was breaking the very rules of reality. A man who didn't just study time, but allegedly learned to step outside it. The exiled astrologer read the heavens like a condemned man reads his sentence, each constellation a verdict, each comet's tail a brushstroke of doom. While Templar commanders planned campaigns by daylight, Brother Gilulmus bent over astrolabes in locked towers, his calculations tracing paths not of armies but of fate itself. His crime wasn't heresy but precision. In 1298, he warned the Grand Master of a great darkness aligned with Saturn's transit, a prophecy dismissed until Philip IV's agents struck on Friday the 13th, the exact date Gilulmus had circled in blood-red ink 3 years prior. Medieval minds saw such foresight as divine or diabolical. When his next prediction hinted at the Order's destruction by a king crowned with iron, whispers turned to accusations. Had he cursed them by speaking the unthinkable aloud, or worse, had his charts revealed a future so inevitable it sapped the brothers' will to resist? The council's verdict was swift: exile. Stripped of his robes, Gilulmus was shipped to a Cypriot monastery, where he reportedly scratched celestial diagrams onto his cell walls with fish bones. Yet even silenced, his influence lingered. A surviving fragment from the Chinon trials mentions a knight who, when pressed about secret rites, replied only, "Ask the star reader." He knew it all before we did. What makes his story so haunting isn't just the accuracy of his predictions, but the medieval paradox they exposed. The Templars prided themselves on defying impossible odds, yet here was a man insisting some threads couldn't be unraveled, not even by their holy swords. His exile proved the Order's fatal contradiction. They'd built an empire on controlling the uncontrollable, from finance to warfare, only to founder when faced with a truth as old as Babylon, that knowledge of destiny doesn't alter its course. Yet as Gilulmus's stars faded from Templar skies, another figure emerged, one who spat in the face of fate itself. Because the 19th shadow didn't read omens, he burned them. The Grail's guardian carried a burden no sword could defend. A relic wrapped in silence, its very existence a heresy waiting to ignite. Unlike the shining chalices of legend, this knight's charge was something far more volatile. A shard of blackened silver, rumored to have caught the last breath of Christ as it slipped from the cross. The order called it veritas non grata, the unwelcome truth, and its keeper was chosen not for his piety, but for his ability to forget. Fragments of his story survive in conflicting whispers. A Moorish prisoner's diary describes a gaunt Frankish knight who refused to remove his gloves, even in the desert heat, his fingers forever clutching a small lead casket. A Venetian spy reported a midnight ceremony in Cyprus where the relic was passed to a new guardian only for the outgoing knight to collapse dead moments later, as if released from some unseen pact. But the most chilling account comes from a Templar squire's final confession, scribbled on the back of a stolen indulgence. They say the guardian never sleeps. That his eyes reflect not firelight, but whatever darkness lies inside that box. His final act defies logic. As Philip IV's men stormed the Paris temple in 1307, witnesses claim the guardian walked calmly into the underground vaults not to hide the relic, but to smash its container against the stones. The resulting explosion, described as a soundless light that peeled back the night, left no body, only a circular patch of fused pavement where the silver shard had supposedly vaporized. Was this divine intervention, alchemy gone awry, or simply a desperate man ensuring no king could weaponize what even the Templars feared to understand? What lingers isn't just the mystery of the relic, but the psychological toll of guarding it. The Guardian's predecessors left behind strange clues, a journal page where the ink had been clawed away, a prayer book with every reference to light meticulously erased. These weren't men corrupted by power, but hollowed by it, their souls eroded like cliffs facing an endless sea. And yet, in their isolation, they may have touched something the Order's priests only preached about, a faith so absolute it needed no witness but darkness itself. But as the last Guardian's light flickered out, another flame was already burning, one not of relics or secrets, but of raw, unflinching devotion. Because the 20th shadow didn't protect sacred objects, he became one. The last Templar priest heard confessions in the hollows of oak trees and baptized converts in moonlit streams, his very existence a defiance of history's verdict. While the world believed the Order extinguished in 1314, this unnamed cleric moved through the back alleys of Europe like a ghost with a stole, offering the sacraments to scattered brothers who dared to remember. His chapel was a fisherman's shack in Brittany, a charcoal burner's hut in the Black Forest, even the hold of a Genos cargo ship where salt-stained sailors knelt on coiled ropes to receive communion. What made his ministry so dangerous wasn't just its secrecy, but its symbolism. He didn't merely preserve rituals, he reinvented them. The Latin Mass blurred into local dialects, the Templar cross was carved into bread rather than embroidered on banners. In Bavaria, he reportedly performed the Easter Vigil using a helmet as a chalice, its dented rim a stark reminder of the brothers who died wearing it. A shepherd's diary from 1321 describes stumbling upon a midnight service where the priest anointed wounds with oil scented like Jerusalem myrrh, whispering not absolution, but battle coordinates for safe houses across Navarre. Here's the paradox that haunts historians. This man's greatest act of faith may have been his willingness to distort it. To keep the spirit alive, he trimmed its sails, allowing Templar survivors to swear oaths on plowshares instead of swords, to substitute the names of local saints for forbidden invocations. Some purists would call this heresy, others the purest form of devotion, a faith so resilient it could shed its skin without losing its soul. Evidence of his survival hides in plain sight. A fresco in a Catalan church shows a tonsured monk holding a lamb, standard iconography, until you notice the lamb's fleece is patterned with the faintest hint of a red cross. A Swiss chronicle mentions a mad hermit who in 1348 predicted the Black Death would spare villages where the Knight's bread was buried beneath doorsteps, a clear reference to the Templars' secret grain stores. Most chilling, the confession of a Spanish inquisitor who, before his execution in 1392, claimed to have tortured a man who knew where the last priest keeps the unbroken chain. And as this cleric's footsteps faded into folklore, others emerged from the wreckage not to mourn the Order's death, but to midwife its rebirth. Because the 21st Shadow didn't cling to the past, he smuggled its embers into an unexpected future. The Merchant of Secrets never bartered in spices or silk. His cargo was far more dangerous. To the world, he was Francesco della Rova, a Venetian trader specializing in antiquities of uncertain provenance. But beneath his ledger's mundane entries, 12 bolts of Flemish cloth, 1 crate of corroded chalices lay the Templars' last hope. His genius wasn't just concealment, but transformation. A gilded reliquary became a Saracen curiosity with a forged bill of sale. A sword said to have splintered at Hatton was quietly welded back together and sold to a Milanese collector as a tournament souvenir. Even the Order's sacred texts found new life as Egyptian grain tariffs when he soaked their pages in vinegar to fade the ink, then rebound them with mundane covers. His network stretched from Constantinople to Cork, a web of collaborators who asked no questions. A Jewish scribe in Marseille altered ship manifests for a cut of the profits. A Norse shipmaster with a grudge against French kings transported crates of turnips that never spoiled, even on month-long voyages. But the merchant's masterpiece was his system of falling warehouses, storage cellars rented under false names, then abandoned after a single use, their contents shifted under cover of storms or riots. When Philip IV's agents raided a Lyon safe house in 1309, they found only a mocking note in cipher: "The moon trades what the sun cannot see." Yet the true cost of his trade wasn't gold, but trust. A ledger fragment from 1312 reveals his darkest bargain, selling a fake Templar treasure map to a rival merchant, knowing the man's family would be slaughtered when the trail led to a Burgundian duke's land. The margin notation reads simply, "Necessity has no conscience." By the time the Pope's spies closed in, the merchant had vanished into his own legend. Some said he died in a Pisan brothel, poisoned over a disputed invoice. Others claimed he reinvented himself as a Portuguese spice trader, his new identity funded by one last transaction: the silent auction of a certain silver shroud to an anonymous bidder in Alexandria. But for every relic he saved, another life frayed in the shadows, which makes the next figure's sacrifice all the more chilling because the 22nd Shadow didn't smuggle artifacts. He smuggled children. The Widow of the Wall wore her grief like armor, a noblewoman who turned her castle's very stones into instruments of defiance. When the Templars fell, Isabel de Chalons didn't just offer refuge, she redesigned her ancestral home into a labyrinth of salvation. Hidden staircases spiraled behind tapestries, chapel altars pivoted to reveal bolt holes. Even the wine cellar's barrels sat atop trapdoors leading to underground rivers. Her genius lay in weaponizing the world's assumptions. No inquisitor would suspect a grieving widow, let alone search her embroidery basket for coded messages or inspect the hollowed-out heels of her mourning slippers. But her true rebellion was subtler. She forced the Order to rely on a woman's leadership. Medieval chronicles dismiss her as a benefactress, but Templar fugitives knew better. Their letters, scorched at the edges from hasty burning, addressed her as La Commandante, detailing supply routes she orchestrated through networks of midwives and wet nurses. When a French patrol once demanded to search her castle, she served them wine laced with a laxative brew, then smuggled 3 knights out in the ensuing chaos disguised as physicians. The audacity was breathtaking. She didn't just hide men, she rewrote the rules of sanctuary. Legends cling to her like ivy. Villagers still whisper that on stormy nights, her ghost paces the castle's crumbling ramparts, lantern in hand, guiding lost souls to safety. A 19th century restoration crew found a rusted key embedded in a wall when cleaned. Its bow bore the faintest engraving of a Templar cross. Was it hers? Or one last secret she took to her grave? Her legacy cracks open medieval hypocrisy. The same church that barred women from battlefields relied on them to save its fallen warriors. Isabel proved that faith wasn't forged just in sword blows, but in the quiet calculus of risk. The moment a widow chose to light a candle in a window, knowing it might burn her whole world down. And as her candle flickered into memory, 3 final figures emerged from the ashes, each carrying a fragment of the Order's soul into an uncertain future. The 23rd Shadow didn't just survive the purge, he redefined what survival meant. The orphaned squire never knew his family's faces, only the flames that took them. Found curled in the ashes of a burned-out village near Montsaga, the boy was no older than 6 when the Templars scooped him up, not out of charity, but because he'd done something impossible: survive. They named him Simon of the Embers, dressed him in scraps of chainmail, and put him to work polishing swords too heavy for his small hands. To the Order, he was just another war orphan, another soul forged in the furnace of the Crusades. But Simon carried something darker than grief, a memory etched in smoke and screaming, and the unmistakable crest of the knights who'd slaughtered his parents fluttering above the carnage. Here's the cruel twist: the Templars who raised him weren't the ones who'd burned his village. That atrocity belonged to a rogue band of crusaders, mercenaries who'd draped themselves in the Order's symbols to pillage unchecked. By the time the truth surfaced, Simon was already steeped in Templar doctrine, his child's heart tangled in a knot of vengeance and devotion. He could have walked away, many squires did, but the Order had given him something no amount of blood could wash clean: purpose. They taught him to read by tracing Latin psalms, let him warm his hands at their campfires, even laughed when he mimicked their sword drills with a stick. For a boy with nothing, that fragile belonging was a kind of salvation. Years later, when Simon stood trembling over the bed of a dying mercenary, a man he'd tracked across 3 kingdoms, a man who still wore a grimy Templar cross around his neck, the knife in his hand wasn't just steel. It was the weight of every bedtime story told by brothers who didn't know they were raising their own accuser. Every lesson in honor drilled into him by men who'd unwittingly sheltered a viper. The mercenary's last words weren't a plea or a confession, but a wheezing laugh. "You'll die wearing their cross too, boy." And in that moment, Simon realized the true cost of his loyalty. Killing this man wouldn't bring back his family. It would just make him another link in the chain of violence that had orphaned him. He buried the knife in the dirt instead of the man's heart, but the choice hollowed him. From that night on, Simon served with a quiet ferocity that unsettled even veteran knights. He volunteered for every suicidal rearguard action, took the most brutal watch shifts, and according to a scribbled note in a commander's ledger, once held a mountain pass alone for 12 hours against 20 bandits, his small frame camouflaged in the rocks. Was it penance, a death wish, or some twisted hope that if he bled enough for the Order, he might finally wash away the shame of loving the men who'd given him everything except justice? When the purge came, Simon was among the last to surrender, not out of fanaticism, but because he'd made peace with a truth that would have shattered a lesser man. Sometimes the family you choose is worth forgiving, even when they wear the same colors as the monsters who destroyed you. His final act, smuggling a chest of orphanage funds to a Cistercian abbey under cover of night, the coins wrapped in his own cloak. the same red cross he'd once loathed now cradling the next generation of lost children. And as Simon's story faded into the footnotes of history, another figure stepped forward, one who didn't just survive the Templars' fall, but turned their destruction into something far more dangerous, a legend that refused to die. The executioner's mercy wore his contradictions like a second skin, a man paid to kill, yet who saved more Templars than any bishop dared to pardon. Officially, he was Henry Le Bourreau, the Paris hangman whose rope had snapped the necks of thieves and heretics for a decade. But in the pre-dawn hours of executions, when the squares lay empty and the cobblestones still held the night's chill, he became something else entirely. A loosened knot here, a wax-coated noose there, small acts of sabotage that let condemned men gasp just long enough for sympathetic guards to dispose of their corpses into waiting carts. His methods were as precise as they were brutal. A smuggled knife to sever ropes at the critical moment, a whispered signal to stage a collapse before the drop, even the strategic placement of a hay wagon to break falls from the gallows. What makes his story so unsettling isn't just the risk, it's the psychology. Henry wasn't some noble sympathizer. He'd executed Templars without hesitation in the Purge's early days, even boasting of their sturdy necks in taverns. But something shifted when he faced Brother Gauthier, an elderly knight who'd once saved Henry's son from drowning in the Seine years before the arrests. As he fitted the noose, Gauthier didn't beg for mercy. He simply whispered, "Remember the river." That night, Henry returned home and vomited into his wash basin until his ribs ached. The next morning, Gauthier's body vanished en route to the pauper's pit. From then on, Henry walked a razor's edge. He couldn't save them all. Too many eyes watched the high-profile executions, but in smaller towns, his network grew. A bribed gravedigger would accidentally leave a coffin unlatched. A prison guard would look the other way as a corpse stirred in the death cart. The key was inconsistency, letting some die so others might live, a macabre calculus that left him hollow-eyed and drinking alone by midnight. The cruelest twist, his ultimate betrayal came not from the crown, but from the very men he'd spared. In 1312, a group of rescued Templars, recognizing his face from the gallows, nearly beat him to death before realizing he was their savior. The incident broke something in him. He quit his post, vanished into the Breton countryside, and was last seen tending the grave of an unnamed knight beneath a yew tree. A scrap of his journal survives in a Rowan archive, its ink blurred by what might have been rain or tears. "I hang between hells, but the rope frays." And as Henry's hands finally stilled, the 25th shadow emerged, not from the darkness, but from the light itself. Because the final figure didn't hide from history, he rewrote it in plain sight. The Chronicler's heir was a man who shouldn't have existed, a scribe employed by Philip IV himself, tasked with erasing the Templars from memory. Yet every night, after sealing the official records, Guillaume de Nogaret's unlikeliest spy would unroll a second scroll and write the truth in lemon juice between the lines of royal decrees. His gamble was breathtaking, hiding heresy in the king's own archives, knowing the invisible ink would darken with age while the lies above it faded. His masterstroke came in 1313. As Philip ordered every mention of the order purged from chronicles, the scribe accidentally mixed Templar financial records with mundane tax ledgers, documents so dull they escaped the burnings. Today, historians still stumble upon these palimpsests, a grocery list from Poitiers revealing a secret commandery's location, a wine inventory hinting at hidden tunnels beneath the Temple Mount. But his true legacy was subtler. In the margin of Philip's death warrant for Jacques de Molay, he sketched a tiny, perfect dove, not in protest, but as a quiet promise that some stories refuse to end when the ink runs dry. And so the circle closes. From the first shadow to the last, these 25 souls prove an uncomfortable truth. History isn't just written by the victors. Sometimes it's whispered by the ones who slipped through their fingers. The Chronicler's ghost lingers in the margins of his own work, a historian who meticulously documented the lives of 24 forgotten Templars, only to set flame to every trace of himself. Picture a dim scriptorium in some nameless monastery, the air thick with the scent of burning vellum as this faceless figure scratches out the last reference to his existence. He doesn't just omit his name, he methodically alters the ink on earlier pages, ensuring his handwriting matches no known scribes. His final act isn't preservation, but precision vandalism, a self-erasure so complete modern scholars debate whether he was one man or a composite of many. The irony is almost poetic. In saving these shadows from oblivion, he becomes the 25th shadow himself. A single clue survives, a cryptic note tucked into the binding of a surviving manuscript, its edges charred as if rescued mid-burn. Let the work speak, not the hand that wrote it. Was this humility or something darker? Some historians suspect he wasn't just hiding, he was protecting others. Because the manuscript doesn't just tell stories, it encrypts them. Page numbers correspond to Templar battle formations. Illuminations hide maps in their foliage. Even the saints' feast days listed in the margins align with dates of lost relic transfers. This wasn't history, it was a weapon disguised as a chronicle, and that's the real tragedy. We'll never know how many more like him existed, how many scrubbed their fingerprints from the record to keep these stories alive. Every medieval library likely held at least one such ghost, some monk or merchant or minor noble who understood that truth survives best when detached from the teller. Their anonymity wasn't an accident, it was the price of admission into a secret war against forgetting. So the next time you hear about the Templars, remember, the Grand Masters and famous knights are just the tip of the spear. Beneath them stretch layers of invisible architects, men and women who built empires with quills and ledgers and lies, then vanished into the foundations they laid. Their greatest legacy isn't what they left behind, but what they willingly gave up, the right to be remembered. And in that sacrifice, they became something far more enduring than heroes. They became the keepers of the silence that outlasts even history itself. From the scribe whose ink bound the order's secrets to the executioner whose noose became an unlikely lifeline, these 25 shadows remind us that history isn't a single torch carried by kings. It's 1,000 flickering candles held by hands we've forgotten. Think of the herbalist whose remedies bordered on heresy, the widow who turned her grief into a sanctuary, or the chronicler who burned his own name to preserve the truth. None of them stood on balconies to receive accolades, yet without them, the Templars would have been little more than a footnote, their legacy crumbling like unmarked graves. What's haunting isn't just their anonymity, but how deliberately it was enforced. Some were erased to protect secrets, others because their work defied the grand narratives of faith and power. A nun's healing hands didn't fit the chivalric myth. A forger's artistry undermined the illusion of divine order. Even the alchemist, whose experiments might have rewritten science, was deemed too dangerous to remember. These weren't footnotes, they were the ink the official history was written over. So here's the challenge. If the Templars, one of history's most scrutinized orders, could hide so many architects of their destiny, who else is missing from the stories we think we know? The next time you walk past an ancient monument or read some chronicle's polished prose, ask yourself, whose fingerprints were scrubbed from this? Because power isn't just about who gets remembered, it's about who gets to do the remembering. As the medieval poet Ibn Khaldun once wrote, The past resembles the future more than one drop of water resembles another. These shadows prove it. Their legacies weren't lost, they were scattered, waiting for someone to piece them back together. So tell us in the comments, whose untold story do you think deserves the light? And if you're hungry for more hidden histories, hit subscribe, because the past is full of whispers and we're just getting started.